People went to sleep in the greatest empire the world had ever known and woke up dying. Fever struck without warning. Skin burned, throats closed. Dark eruptions spread across bodies in crowded homes and military camps. Within days, sometimes hours, entire households vanished. In Rome, the air filled with smoke from constant cremations. In the provinces, farms were abandoned. Along the frontiers, legions collapsed without ever meeting an enemy. This was not a foreign invasion. This was not a rebellion. It was something far more terrifying. An invisible enemy was moving through the veins of the Roman Empire itself. The disease traveled with soldiers returning from the Eastern Wars. It passed through ports, roads, and marketplaces, through the very infrastructure that made Rome powerful. At its height, thousands were dying every single day. Even the emperor could not escape it. The philosopher King Marcus Aurelius, ruler of the known world, watched the empire decay while he himself struggled to survive. To the Romans, this felt like the gods had turned away. Temples filled with desperate prayers. Doctors stood helpless. Order, discipline, and certainty. The foundations of Roman civilization began to crack. What no one alive could see was that this pandemic would outlast the screams, the funerals, and the fear. It would drain Rome's population, shatter its economy, weaken its armies, and quietly push the empire onto a path it would never fully escape. This was the Antonine Plague, and to understand how it helped kill the Roman Empire, we must first return to the world that existed just before everything began to fall apart. If you're enjoying this journey through time, remember to like the video and tell us in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? Before the sickness, before the fear, before the silence, the Roman Empire believed it had solved the problem of history. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, Rome ruled over an estimated 60 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population. Its borders were secure. Its economy was vast. Its cities were alive with movement, sound, and confidence. For generations, Romans had known peace on a scale few civilizations ever achieved. Historians would later call this era the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. From Britain to Egypt, stone roads stitched the empire together. Grain flowed from North Africa. Wine traveled from Gaul. Spices arrived from the east. A merchant could cross continents under the protection of Roman law, Roman soldiers, and Roman order. This was not just an empire of conquest. It was an empire of systems. And those systems worked. Cities expanded beyond their ancient walls. Aqueducts carried clean water. Public baths filled daily with citizens of every class. Markets overflowed with goods from lands most Romans would never see. Life expectancy, while still fragile by modern standards, had slowly improved. Population grew. Optimism followed. At the center of this world sat Rome itself, a city of perhaps 1 million people. Dense, loud, relentlessly alive. Apartment blocks rose several stories high. Streets were narrow. Homes shared walls. Fires, smells, voices and bodies blended into a single organism. It was a triumph of civilization. It was also a perfect environment for catastrophe. The Roman army mirrored this same efficiency. Nearly 30 legions guarded the frontiers, each one a disciplined machine of men, weapons, and logistics. Soldiers marched together, slept together, ate together. Camps were temporary cities, crowded, organized, and constantly moving. In the 160s AD, many of these soldiers were fighting far from home in the eastern provinces during wars against the Parthian Empire. They would win those wars. They would return as heroes. They would also return carrying something else. At the top of this world stood Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, emperor, reluctant ruler. He believed deeply in reason, duty, and self-control. To him, the universe was governed by logic. Events had causes. Suffering had meaning. The empire, under his watch, appeared stable, but cracks were already forming beneath the marble surface. Rome's prosperity depended on movement, constant movement. Goods, people, armies, slaves, animals, always flowing. The faster the empire moved, the stronger it became. No one asked what else might be moving with them. Medical knowledge was limited. Disease was explained through imbalance, bad air, or divine punishment. Germs were unimaginable. Contagion, poorly understood. When illness appeared, Romans treated symptoms, not causes. And so, as soldiers began returning from the east, they were welcomed home. Parades marched through cities, camps emptied. Men embraced families they had not seen in years. Taverns filled, baths overflowed, and quietly, invisibly, something ancient entered the bloodstream of the empire. At first, it seemed localized. A strange sickness here, a sudden death there. Nothing Rome had not seen before. Plagues came and went. The empire endured, but this time was different. This time, the disease did not fade. It followed the roads, it followed the rivers, it followed Rome itself. The very achievements that made the empire powerful, its unity, its density, its connectivity, were about to be turned against it. Rome had built the greatest network the ancient world had ever known, and now, that network was about to carry death to every corner of the empire. It began at the edges of the empire. Soldiers returned from the eastern campaigns victorious, hardened by war, carrying scars of battle, and something far more dangerous than any Parthian blade. As they disembarked at ports like Ostia and Antioch, no alarms were raised. There were no quarantines, no understanding of what traveled within them. The sickness announced itself brutally. High fever, unrelenting thirst, inflamed eyes, a burning sensation beneath the skin. Then came the eruptions, dark, blistering sores spreading across the body. When they ruptured, victims sometimes survived. When they did not, death followed swiftly. Days, sometimes hours. Panic spread faster than knowledge. In the crowded insulae of Rome, families lived stacked upon one another. Illness moved vertically, from floor to floor, and horizontally through entire neighborhoods. Markets emptied, workshops closed. The poor suffered first, but the disease did not stop there. Senators fell ill. Priests collapsed at altars. Soldiers died in their barracks. The empire had no language for what was happening. One man, however, tried to understand it. Galen, the most famous physician of the ancient world, witnessed the plague firsthand. He described its symptoms in clinical detail: fever, diarrhea, skin eruptions, internal bleeding. Even with his knowledge, even with Roman medicine at its peak, there was no cure. Doctors could only observe and flee. As the death toll rose, fear replaced reason. Some believed the plague was punishment from the gods. Temples overflowed with desperate offerings. Others blamed poisoned wells, foreign magic, or corrupted air. Bonfires burned day and night, meant to cleanse the atmosphere. Nothing worked. The disease followed Rome's arteries. From the capital, it spread into Gaul, across the Danube, into Spain, down into North Africa. Wherever Roman roads reached, the plague followed. The army suffered catastrophically. Entire units weakened. Recruitment collapsed. Veterans died faster than they could be replaced. On the frontiers, Rome's enemies watched carefully. They saw fewer patrols, quieter forts, slower responses. Inside the cities, the rhythm of life shattered. Funerals became constant. Cremation pyres burned without pause. In some places, bodies were abandoned in the streets because there was no one left to bury them. Trade slowed as merchants feared travel. Grain shipments were delayed. Hunger followed sickness. And still, the plague returned. This was not a single wave. It came again and again, over more than a decade. Each time, it carved deeper into the population. Children, laborers, soldiers, administrators. Even the imperial household was not spared. The co-emperor Lucius Verus died suddenly in 169 AD, likely a victim of the disease. Rome lost not just men, it lost leadership, experience, continuity. For Marcus Aurelius, the crisis became existential. He ruled an empire unraveling from within, while external threats pressed against its borders. In his private writings, he reflected on mortality, impermanence, and the fragility of human achievement. The plague was not just killing people. It was eroding trust, breaking systems, exposing how dependent Rome was on constant stability. What had once felt eternal now felt fragile. And as the bodies piled higher, the empire faced a terrifying realization. This was not a disaster that could be conquered with legions or laws. This enemy did not negotiate, it did not retreat, and it did not care that Rome believed itself invincible. The Antonine plague had embedded itself deep within the empire's body, and the consequences were only beginning. When the dead can no longer work, an empire begins to starve. As the Antonine plague dragged on year after year, its most devastating effect was not only the loss of life, it was the slow suffocation of Rome's systems. Fields lay untilled, workshops fell silent, tax records became meaningless as entire communities vanished. The Roman Empire had been built on surplus grain, surplus labor, surplus revenue. Now, all three were disappearing at once. Across the countryside, farms were abandoned. Fewer hands meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant higher prices. In the cities, food shortages triggered unrest. Bread distributions, once a symbol of Roman generosity, became unreliable. The state still demanded taxes, but fewer people remained to pay them. To compensate, imperial officials raised rates on those who survived. The burden grew heavier. Resentment followed. Local elites, once proud partners in Roman administration, struggled to maintain order in their regions. At the same time, the army was bleeding manpower. Legions that once stood at full strength were now skeletal. Recruitment became desperate. Boys and older men were pressed into service. Standards slipped. Discipline weakened. On the frontiers, Rome could no longer project the same overwhelming presence. Enemies noticed. Along the Rhine and Danube, tribal groups tested Roman defenses more aggressively. Raids increased. Forts once considered secure were now undermanned. Rome still responded, but slower, weaker, stretched thin. To fund the military and keep the state functioning, emperors turned to a dangerous solution: debasing the currency. Silver content in coins was reduced. More money was minted, but it was worth less. Inflation spread quietly through the empire. Prices rose. Trust in Roman coinage eroded. Trade slowed further as merchants hesitated to accept unstable currency. The empire was trapped in a vicious cycle. Less population meant less revenue. Less revenue meant weaker defense. Weaker defense meant instability. Instability made recovery impossible. Even governance suffered. Administrative posts went unfilled. Experience died with its holders. Decision-making slowed as the state struggled to respond to multiple crises at once. For the first time in centuries, Romans began to sense something deeply unsettling. The empire no longer felt permanent. Under Marcus Aurelius, the state still functioned, but only through constant emergency measures. He spent much of his reign on campaign, attempting to stabilize borders while managing disaster at home. In his writings, he returned again and again to the idea that all things decay, that empires, like men, are temporary. These were not abstract thoughts anymore. They were lived reality. The Antonine plague did not destroy Rome overnight. It weakened it in layers. Economic strength faded first. Military dominance followed. Administrative confidence soon after. And worst of all, the sense of Roman superiority, the belief that their world was uniquely ordered and protected, began to dissolve. People still called Rome eternal, but fewer believed it. By the end of the 2nd century, the empire remained vast. Its monuments still stood. Its laws still ruled millions. To an outsider, Rome might have looked unchanged. Inside, however, the damage was done. The foundations had been hollowed out by something no army could fight and no emperor could command. The Antonine plague had transformed Rome from an unshakable giant into a fragile system struggling to survive its own momentum. And the long shadow of that transformation would shape everything that followed. When the worst waves of death finally receded, Rome did not return to what it had been. The cities filled again with noise and movement, but something essential was missing. Too many voices were gone, too many trades broken, too many families ended without heirs. The Roman Empire still stood, yet it stood on altered ground. Survivors carried a quiet knowledge. The old certainty had failed them. For centuries, Romans believed their success proved divine favor. Victory followed victory. Expansion followed expansion. The gods, it seemed, had chosen Rome. But during the plague, prayers had gone unanswered. Sacrifices multiplied. Temples overflowed. Still, people died. Faith did not disappear. It fractured. Traditional religion remained, but it no longer felt sufficient to many. New cults spread more rapidly. Mystery religions promised personal salvation rather than imperial prosperity. Communities that emphasized care for the sick and burial of the dead quietly gained followers. Among them was Christianity, still a minority, still persecuted at times, but growing steadily in the vacuum left by disillusionment. Social bonds also changed. With labor scarce, surviving workers gained leverage. Wages rose in some regions. Social mobility increased slightly as rigid hierarchies bent under necessity. At the same time, the state tightened control where it could, binding people more firmly to professions and land to prevent further collapse. Families became smaller, communities more inward-looking. Travel slowed. Risk was no longer abstract, it was remembered. Even the Roman mindset shifted. Stoic ideals of endurance, duty, and acceptance, championed by Marcus Aurelius, resonated deeply in a world shaped by loss. His reflections on mortality no longer felt philosophical. They felt practical. Death was no longer distant. Impermanence was no longer theoretical. The empire had learned a lesson written in bodies. Complexity brings vulnerability. The same networks that fed Rome, enriched it, and connected it had also exposed it. Order survived, but innocence did not. Rome continued to govern millions. Its laws still held. Its armies still marched. Yet the belief that the empire was protected by destiny had quietly died sometime during the long years of plague. The Antonine plague did not end Rome's story, but it changed the tone of everything that followed. The Antonine plague eventually faded. The dead were buried. The cities breathed again. But the Roman world that emerged was no longer moving forward with the same confidence. It was moving cautiously, reacting rather than expanding, repairing rather than building. The Roman Empire had survived the pandemic, but survival came at a cost that would echo for centuries. Population levels never fully recovered. Fewer people meant fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, fewer producers. To compensate, the state leaned harder on those who remained. Taxes increased, obligations multiplied, freedom narrowed quietly under administrative necessity. The army, once Rome's greatest instrument of control, began to change. Recruitment relied more heavily on outsiders, federated tribes, mercenaries, allies who fought for Rome but were not fully Roman. This solved short-term problems while planting long-term instability. Authority also shifted. Emperors after Marcus Aurelius ruled a more fragile system. Crisis followed crisis. Plagues would return. Civil wars multiplied. Inflation worsened. Trust in central power weakened. Within a century, the empire would enter what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of near total breakdown marked by rapid imperial turnover, economic chaos, and repeated invasions. The Antonine plague did not cause all of this, but it weakened the structure at the worst possible moment. Rome had expanded to its limits. Its complexity demanded constant balance. The plague removed the margin for error. From that point on, every shock hit harder. Every failure cost more. Recovery became slower, less complete. What had once been resilience became rigidity. Adaptation still happened. Reforms, new administrative systems, new military strategies, but always in response to damage already done. Rome was no longer shaping the future, it was managing decline. And yet, this was not a sudden fall. The empire would endure for centuries more in various forms. Laws, culture, language, and memory would outlive the state itself. But the illusion of inevitability, the belief that Rome was unbreakable, died in the 2nd century. Not with fire, not with conquest, but with fever, breathlessness, and silence. The Antonine Plague revealed a truth that history would repeat again and again. The greatest threats to civilizations are often not external enemies, but invisible forces moving through the systems they trust most. Rome had conquered the world, but it could not conquer nature. When the noise finally faded, Rome was still standing. Its roads still cut across continents, its laws still shaped daily life, its name still commanded respect. But something essential had been lost. The Antonine Plague did not arrive with the drama of a single catastrophic moment. It came quietly, patiently, moving through homes, armies, and cities, reminding humanity that even the most powerful civilization on Earth was never truly in control. Rome believed it had mastered history. It had mastered space. It had mastered people. What it could not master was fragility. The plague exposed a truth that feels uncomfortably familiar today. Complexity creates strength, but it also creates vulnerability. The same connections that build prosperity can just as easily carry collapse. Progress does not erase risk, it reshapes it. Rome survived, but it survived changed, more cautious, more rigid, less certain of its destiny. And perhaps that is the real legacy of the Antonine Plague. Not the bodies it left behind, but the illusion it destroyed. The moment when humanity learned, once again, that history does not end at the height of power. It bends, it breaks, and it asks the same question of every age. How resilient is the world you've built? If this story moved you, hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves history, and subscribe so you never miss the next era we explore together. Tell us in the comments, what lesson from ancient Rome feels most relevant today? The moment fades, but its meaning remains. This is Old World View.